The chains creaked slowly as the wheel turned, pulling the prisoner's arms and legs in opposite directions. His scream echoed across the damp stone chamber, bouncing off walls, stained dark with the blood of those who came before. With each crank, his joints popped, tendons tore, and bones threatened to snap. Outside the torture chamber, the guard smirked. Inside, pain became religion. What kind of society finds pleasure in stretching a man until his limbs tear apart? Welcome to the Middle Ages, a time when cruelty was not hidden in shadows, but worn like armor, sanctioned by kings, and blessed by the church. Here, justice was not blind, it was bloodthirsty, and punishment. It was theater played out in dungeons, town squares, and cathedrals alike. This is not a history of laws or kings. This is a history of agony, of punishment so unimaginable it would make even demons weep. Maintaining control in a fractured, superstitious world plagued by war, famine, and heresy. The church ruled not only the soul but the body, and with it came a twisted sense of divine authorities, one that claimed pain was purifying. In this dark journey, we begin with one of the most infamous tools ever crafted by human hands, the rack. And how were these confessions extracted? Through steel, fire, and blood. But first, let us descend into the madness that allowed such horror to flourish. Kings and queens saw torture as both a punishment and a message. The spine stretched beyond its limits, sometimes rupturing vertebrae, ligaments tore, muscles separated from the bone. To rebel was to die screaming, to sin was to suffer. And when they finally passed out from the pain, a bucket of water or a jab from a hot poker brought them back to consciousness. All carried the trauma of their time on the rack for the rest of their short, tormented lives. Why? Because the agony wasn't just punishment, it was performance, a spectacle for kings, a lesson for the crowd. Rollers at either end, ropes tied to the wrists and ankles of the victim. He later described his torture. I thought my belly would have burst and my heart to have jumped out of my mouth. But simplicity is deception, for the rack is not a mere device, it is a symphony of destruction. Torture served a dual purpose. First, to extract confessions, truths, real or fabricated, that would justify further executions. Second, to terrify the populace into obedience. Every scream in the dungeon echoed as a warning through the city streets. And when the body gave in before the tongue, it was considered divine justice. In medieval Europe, justice was rarely about fairness. It was about order. The Inquisition, a brutal religious court established to root out heresy, turned confessions into a currency of salvation. More tools, more creativity, more ways to rip apart the human form while keeping the victim alive long enough to confess. The inventors of these tools were not monsters, but men engineers of agony who believed their work served justice, God, or the crown. The tools gleamed with rust. Rats scurried through puddles of filth. ChatGPT, another device, would soon arise that crushed the very soul of its victims. Chains hung from ceilings like vines in a forgotten jungle. The monarchs, too, had their share of cruelty, and the methods, each more vicious than the last. Let us begin with a rack. At first glance, it is simple, a rectangular wooden frame. The torturer would ask a question: where are your fellow heretics? If the answer was unsatisfactory, the wheel turned. With each rotation, the body was pulled longer, inch by inch, shoulders dislocated, knees snapped. Victims sometimes screamed until their vocal cords snapped like fiddle strings. And yet, this wasn't the most horrifying part. Survivors, if they could still be called that, were often left permanently maimed. Some never walked again. Some had their arms twisted backward at unnatural angles. One such man was William Lithgow, a Scottish traveler in the 1600s, captured in Spain under suspicion of espionage. He begged for death. They gave him another turn of the wheel instead. But why such cruelty? The answer lies not just in punishment but in control. The rooms where these tortures occurred were often underground, lit by torchlight, and reeking of old blood and rot. No laws governed how long one could be tortured. No protections existed for the innocent. Guilt was assumed. To endure the rack was to step into hell, and to understand that in medieval Europe, hell was not metaphorical. It was handcrafted. But the rack was just the beginning. Torture evolved like a dark science, and while the rack tore limbs apart, but that is a story for the next descent into darkness. For now, remember this. In an age ruled by fear, torture was not hidden. It was celebrated. Ask. The man stood naked, trembling, his ankles and wrists bound. In the center of the dark stone chamber sat a wooden pyramid, its point glistening with blood from the last soul who sat upon it. The torturer smiled, not out of cruelty, but routine. This was his work, his craft, and today, his tool was the Judas chair. They were meant to destroy everything else: dignity, sanity, and identity. The torturers took their time. Ropes would stretch the victim's limbs outward while lowering them slowly onto the point. In some cases, weights were tied to the ankles, ensuring the spike forced its way deeper into the body. The result was a prolonged death of pain, infection, and humiliation. These instruments weren't just tools of punishment, they were surgical instruments designed to humiliate, silence, and erase. Let us journey deeper into the pit. They hoisted the prisoner above the sharp wooden spike. He screamed before he even touched it, but they weren't finished. Slowly, ever so slowly, they lowered him down. For a woman accused of lying about her chastity, the pair delivered a punishment worse than death. It destroyed her not just physically, but socially. Blood poured from places no one dared to look at. But the worst part, many did not die. They were left alive, broken, barren, and discarded. Even if she survived, she could never bear children again. Gravity did the rest. The point pierced into the most sensitive part of his body, splitting flesh with excruciating precision. No organs were ruptured. He would not die quickly. The victim bled for hours, sometimes days. Screams were muffled by the steel walls. That was the point. Not just pain but suffocation, darkness, isolation. The body becomes a tomb. The mind, a prison. How much pain does it take before the mind breaks? In the vast collection of medieval torture devices, some were not meant to kill, but whether real or myth, its symbolism is undeniable. A device shaped like a mother, designed to kill like a monster. The very image of twisted mercy. But inside, dozens of razor-sharp iron spikes lined every inch, not long enough to kill quickly, but just deep enough to pierce organs, slice through skin, and create slow, unspeakable agony. We will watch as the flames rise and the skin melts. When inserted into the mouth, anus, or vagina, a screw at its base would slowly open the metal leaves inside, the body tearing from within. The Judas chair, also called the Judas cradle, was a triangular seat designed to impale the victim gradually. To worsen the agony, torturers would rock the body side to side, twisting and tearing muscle. And that was exactly the goal. This device was often used on prisoners accused of sodomy or heresy. It was not only meant to inflict pain, but to shame, to turn the body itself into an object of ridicule. The silent implication was brutal. Your sin enters through this place, now it shall bleed through it. But that wasn't the only tool designed for such intimate horror. There was the pear of anguish. Small, metallic, and deceptively elegant, the pear resembled a closed fruit made of steel. It was favored for special offenses: blasphemy, homosexuality, female adultery, and false pregnancy. Witnesses spoke of how victims shrieked like animals as the screw turned. If the Judas chair was a message, the pear was a curse. And then there was the most infamous of all, the Iron Maiden. Standing tall like a sarcophagus, the Iron Maiden looked almost holy at first glance, modeled after the Virgin Mary herself. The victim was placed inside. The doors were closed slowly. The spikes drove inward, not enough to strike the heart, but enough to puncture the stomach, lungs, and bowels. There is debate among historians as to whether the Iron Maiden truly existed in medieval times or was a later invention. Imagine the psychological weight of being locked inside such a device. These devices, cradle, pear, maiden, weren't just instruments. They were propaganda, tools of terror crafted to linger in the public imagination. And they succeeded. The Judas chair stood in public squares. The pair passed through whispered legends. The Iron Maiden became the stuff of nightmares. In a society ruled by fear, torture had to be more than physical, it had to be legendary. It had to silence not only the voice, but the soul. And still, this is not the end. There were punishments that burned the flesh, yes, but others, more terrifying still, that boiled it. And in the next chapter, the man was screaming before he even touched the oil. His legs were lowered slowly into the bubbling cauldron, and the skin peeled off like wet parchment. The steam rising from his flesh mixed with the sharp scent of burning fat. The crowd watched in silence, not out of respect, but out of fear. Fire was final. Fire was theatrical. Fire didn't just kill, it erased. No body left, no burial, no afterlife. For centuries, flame became the preferred weapon of kings, clergy, and executioners, whether in the form of boiling oil, molten lead, or pyres lit under the gaze of thousands. Heat was the great purifier of sin and the perfect tool for terror. In the square, children clutched their mothers, and priests murmured prayers. What kind of justice requires your flesh to cook before a crowd? A hollow bull made entirely of bronze, large enough to fit a man inside. Once sealed within, a fire was lit beneath the belly of the beast. Slowly, the metal heated. The air inside turned to flame. The condemned was shackled and lifted above it, forced to watch others suffer before being slowly lowered in. One of the first victims was Richard Roos, a cook who accidentally poisoned a bishop's household. He was dragged through the streets and plunged into a vat as the public looked on, horrified and fascinated. He thrashed, he screamed, and then silence. Flesh hissed, blood boiled, and still, the heart might beat for several moments, enough for the mind to register the full scope of agony. The body became a warning, the smell, a curse that lingered in the streets for days. Whether myth or truth, the message was clear. Those who build tools of torture may one day hear them from within. The victim roasted alive, flesh cooking against the searing walls. Piles of straw and timber were stacked beneath them. The crowd gathered, The executioner stood ready. A priest might offer final rites, a last chance to repent. Even as the fire was being lit, in the grim arsenal of medieval torture, nothing rivaled fire. Boiled them, roasted them, in the name of God, in the name of law, in the name of order. But for the public it was terror, a reminder, defy the church, and you too will burn. Without a body there could be no grave. Without a grave, no mourning. Without mourning, no memory. Left to rot for years, we will descend into the slowest tortures of all those that starved, squeezed, and shattered not in moments, but over months. ChatGPT fire erased people as if they never existed. One of the most terrifying instruments of this fiery judgment was the brazen bull. Joan of Arc, the teenage warrior and saint, was burned alive in 1431, her only crime claiming God had spoken to her. As the flames consumed her, witnesses wept. One English soldier cried out that they had killed a holy woman, but it was too late. But others, less lucky, were devoured by fire slowly. Skin blackened, hair ignited, eyes boiled. The body writhed until the muscles gave out. A system of pipes transformed the screams of the condemned into the sound of a bull bellow. From the outside it was as if the great metal beast had come alive, roaring in pain. It began in ancient Syracuse but found its way into medieval lore through whispered stories and artist renditions. But that was not enough. The genius or madness of the brazen bull lay in its acoustic design. Legends say the creator of the brazen bull, a man named was himself the first to die within it, thrown in by the very tyrant he built it for. But the bull was not the only fire-fed horror. There was boiling. Imagine the terror, a vat of bubbling oil, tar, or even molten lead. In 1531, King Henry VIII passed a law specifically allowing poisoners to be boiled alive. Boiling had a purpose, to make an example so brutal, so unforgettable, that no one would dare repeat the crime. And yet, even that horror pales in comparison to what became the most symbolic and widely used form of fiery execution in medieval Europe: burning at the stake. It was more than punishment, it was ceremony. The condemned were tied to a wooden pole in the center of town. When the flames began, the smoke rose first. Many victims died not from fire, but from asphyxiation, lungs collapsing under the smoke. This was the preferred method of execution for witches, heretics, and traitors. For the church, burning was symbolic. Fire cleansed the soul. Burning at the stake wasn't just death, it was pure. The psychological power of fire was unmatched. To be burned was not just to die, it was to disappear. It was the ultimate control. And so, medieval justice burned its enemies. But even after the fire died down, the cruelty continued. For some, the greatest pain came not from flames or blades but from being slowly crushed beneath their own body weight, or trapped in cages. In the next chapter, the man's arms were already broken, his legs bent the wrong way. His blood soaked the spokes of the great wooden wheel beneath him, yet he still breathed barely. As the executioner raised the iron bar one last time, the crowd gasped. These were the tortures that did not simply destroy the body, but broke the human spirit by robbing it of time, of dignity, of finality. The blow landed on his chest, crushing ribs inward. A gurgling sound escaped his throat, not quite a scream, not quite a word. The victim was tied to a large wheel, limbs stretched outward, body exposed. The executioner used a heavy metal rod or hammer to smash the bones one by one, in a precise order meant to prolong life. Then silence. When the entire body was shattered, the broken remains were often hoisted into the air, still tied to the wheel and left to rot. Eyes wide open, skin turning black, crows gathering. What happens when death doesn't come in minutes, but in days? The diaphragm failed. The heart beat faster to compensate, then slower and slower, until nothing. Giles Corey, an 81-year-old man accused of witchcraft, refused to enter a plea, so they pressed him. For 2 full days, stones were added to his chest. When asked to confess, he did not cry, did not scream. Victims were placed inside, stripped of food, water, or shade, and then hoisted into the air, hung from castle walls, church towers, or gallows poles. He only uttered 3 final words: more weight. If fire was fast and then some tortures were designed to be patient, lethal poetry performed over hours, even weeks. Few methods embodied this more than the breaking wheel, known also as the Catherine wheel, named after St. Catherine, who was sentenced to die by one. It was a tool of public disassembly. Not all blows were meant to kill. In fact, many were aimed between joints or along the shafts of long bones to cause maximum agony while sparing vital organs. Sometimes, if the crime was considered especially heinous, the person was placed on the wheel alive and left for days. At night, the cold crept in through the steel like death's whisper. And the days were long. Longer than pain, longer than thought. Not a scream, but a whisper. Not an execution, but an erosion. To make dying an experience you could remember for every second you still breathed. Flesh long gone, but bones still clinging to metal. A message not written in ink, but in decay, or become part of the scenery. until the body wasted away, skin cracking, lips splitting, the stench attracting flies, vultures, and worse. There are records of victims surviving 2, even 3 days completely immobilized, unable to speak, begging with only their eyes, bones rattling in rusted cages, swinging in the wind like cursed wind. But the wheel was not the only torture that sought to prolong life, just enough for it to be unbearable. In another dark corner of the dungeon stood the pressed. Then, one by one, stones were added slowly, cruelly, each pound a new breath stolen, each minute a lesson in the fragility of lungs and ribs. This device was deceptively simple. A heavy slab of wood or metal placed across the chest of the accused. The victim's body didn't explode, it folded. The bones collapsed inward. Perhaps the most chilling account of this punishment came from colonial America during the infamous Salem witch trials. And then, silence. But silence was the true essence of another horror, the hanging cage. Crafted from iron, shaped to barely hold a man. The cage was both cell and coffin. The sun beat down. Rain poured in. Some prisoners lasted days. Others, mere hours. But the end was always the same. In some towns, the cages were never taken down. They were left there permanently as warnings. Each of these tortures will press. Cage was a slow conversation with death. The Middle Ages didn't just invent ways to kill. They mastered ways to postpone it, to stretch it. So what does this say about the world that built these horrors? It says that justice in its rawest, cruelest form was never blind. It was deliberate. And as we step back from the blood, the fire, and the iron, we are left with one final question, one that echoes through every torture chamber and every silent, rotting cage. If this was justice, then what do we call it now?